The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Mike Simpson. Mike is CEO of Omura. Omura are a technology and design brand focused on the cannabis and wellness space. Mike, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Anuj. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
No, real pleasure. Where in the world are you today?
I'm in sunny Venice in California.
Ah, nice. And you've just been on doing a bit of a European tour as well?
I have. I was doing the Paris Expo, the Vape Expo in Paris and the CBD show in Paris. And then we did the Mary Jane show in Berlin a few weeks back too.
Nice. Nice to be on this side of the pond.
It was really nice to get back. Obviously, nobody's been travelling very much for the last couple of years. So that's my first international travel and squeezed a few countries in 2 weeks. So it was really nice to see Europe, nice people, nice architecture.
Great stuff. Cool. Well, look, we'll talk about Omura in a bit. It's a great device and it'd be great for you to share information about that in a second. But let's talk about you on a personal level. Maybe you can just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and how and why you got into the cannabis industry.
Yeah, thanks, Anuj. I really appreciate the opportunity to indulge myself for a while. So, as you can tell, I'm from the north of England originally. I'll not go too deep, but I worked on the oil rigs when I came out of school. So my background has been extremely diverse. I mustered up the courage to go back to university. I did a couple of degrees in industrial design and ended up working with Lego. And I opened a design office in Tokyo for Lego. And we came up with their number one brand called Exoforce from the Lego office. And then I started working in other industries like sports. I worked for Nike and Adidas, designing performance sneakers and apparel. Then found British American Tobacco, which starts this journey. And I started working on harm reduction technologies with British American Tobacco. I don't know if we want to go into this part of the story too deeply at this moment, but then to fast forward a number of years, I moved to California and I started researching cannabis on behalf of British American Tobacco, which made the logical leap to move into the cannabis industry after realizing many different benefits of, one, the plant, and two, an ideal method of consumption.
Yeah. And so, coming from that tobacco background, what was your sort of level of knowledge? Were you curious? Was there stigma attached around cannabis? What was your approach?
Oh, it's a big question because it's almost stretching back 20 years now. Obviously the stigma around cannabis and the stigma around tobacco has actually had a U-turn where now it's more favourable to smoke cannabis than it is tobacco, which is, we would never have dreamed that would have happened like a decade ago. But yeah, I think there's so many sides to that question. Firstly, getting into the whole area of heat not burn and realizing, the tobacco industry is having a movement essentially, and they're moving into this whole non-combustion direction. That's obviously a game changer. And then realizing that heat not burn for cannabis is actually so much better than combustion. And it's so much better for cannabis than it is for tobacco, for example, because with the tobacco leaf, you need to treat it with various, substances like humectants. It really makes you realize that, the heat not burn for cannabis, the preferential method of consumption. So I didn't really answer your question there about stigmas. Obviously, I'm living in Venice. Everybody smokes weed. It is more natural. When I moved here about 8 years ago, I remember a gentleman walking towards me and I thought he was smoking a cigarette. And the person next to me was like, "Oh, thank God it's weed. I thought that was a cigarette." And it was really just a sign of the times changing. But then, I've just been back in Europe, a couple of weeks back, and the stigma is clearly there still. So it's interesting how the world's changing from, I'd say, probably the West Coast moving. But, obviously we will get into it, but the dominoes are toppling and the rate of change is accelerating.
Yeah. And was that weird when you first arrived, sort of getting your head around that it was so publicly accepted?
Well, yeah, I think it was especially different for me because I'd spent 10 years in Tokyo. When I was at college, everybody smoked a little bit of weed here and there. So it was, pretty commonplace. That was in England, obviously. But then in Tokyo and Japan, it's totally forbidden. There's very severe penalties for using any kind of drugs, and cannabis is up there with the best of them. So then coming over to Venice from Tokyo, it's obviously polar opposite. So it was quite surprising.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so, why don't we move on to talk a bit about Omura then? Why don't you just introduce the company? What do you guys do?
Yeah, thanks, Anuj. Basically, it's dry herb vaporizer platform with pre-filled sticks. So, that's it in a nutshell. But if you don't mind me going back a little bit and telling you why we started it, I obviously alluded to it a little bit, what I was doing with British American Tobacco, developing harm reduction products and understanding harm reduction and non-combustion and heat not burn specifically. But then I came over to California studying the whole cannabis industry for big tobacco, and I was looking at various different aspects of it that may be potential investment opportunities and acquisition targets, but also looking at all of the trends and with a specific focus on looking at all of the heat not burn devices that already existed. So we've got the Volcano by Storrs and Bickel, the packs, these are the most famous ones, but it turns out to be nearly 200 different products on the market which are for heat not burning cannabis. So, this is a testament or validation that it's actually a preferred way of consumption for so many people. Some of the purists or some people like the full entourage effect or, many of the other benefits of using the whole flower. But without exception, each and every one of these devices required the consumer to buy flour, grind flour, fill an oven manually and pack it with, variable consistency, select an incremental temperature, and then use the same mouthpiece every time. Then after the session was finished, you would need to dig out the spent flour by scraping it out of the oven and then using with a metal spatula, then using a brush to get the little small particles out. And then every 10 or 15 times you would need to use rubbing alcohol to dissolve the buildup of residues in the device. And this is a hell of a process, or a ritual as some people may like to call it. But found a lot of people would end up, putting these devices in a drawer and just giving up on them after a while just because they got so dirty and it was so inconvenient. So in short, I realized if you wanted to take this heat not burn ritual to the mass consumer, then you would need to eliminate all of those pain points. So essentially we create a pre-filled stick so you don't need to grind and fill. We've got an exact dose in that stick so you know how high you're going to get and you don't need to faff on with grinding and packing. You simply put the stick in the device and it starts automatically. We've designed a heat curve that goes through all of the optimum temperatures, boils off 98% of the cannabinoids in that stick over a session. When the session's finished, you just take the stick out and throw it in the trash. It's compostable, biodegradable, and no cleaning is ever required because there's no contact between the flour and the heating element. And we use convection technology, it's by far the best method of heating flour. So this is really a kind of the past 20 years of my life probably all rolled up into what I believe to be, the ideal consumption method for cannabis.
Wow, there's loads there, isn't there? I was going to ask you about the comparison to Pax and Storrs and Bickel, who are probably the two main brands in this heat not burn space. And essentially, if you're going to talk about the Omura USP, is it sort of simplifying the whole experience?
It's a great question. I'd like to go back onto both of those excellent products. All products have their issues, but let me get back onto them in a minute. It's simplification, yes, because we needed it to be a seamless process. Take a stick out, put it in, use it. It's as simple as that. But it's not just simplification, it's actually optimization as well. We've had the opportunity to optimize the contents of our stick to the performance of our oven because it's a very known size, very known amount of flour in each stick. We can really optimize the session. So we've been playing with it for a few years, to make the efficiency of each session as perfect as possible. But yeah, both of those devices, I've probably bought more Paxes than anybody else on the planet. I actually used to buy them and do tests with tobacco to see if I could get people stopping smoking. So I did maybe a session with 20 tobacco consumers and give them some American Spirit red rolling tobacco and a Pax and left it with them for a couple of weeks and got reports back on, whether they consider switching rituals from combustion to obviously heat not burn, and got some, incredible findings back that people could actually taste the flavor of the tobacco. They enjoyed the experience more. They didn't have all of the issues you have with your lungs and smoking. So yeah, Pax, brilliant product. I'd say it's the second best looking product on the market after ours. And then, the Storrs and Bickel products, I've spoken with Jürgen Bickel. Bruce Linton had put us in contact with him quite some time back. And obviously the Volcano, it's kind of it's classic. It's a brilliant device, but it is what it is. It sits on a table. It's the size of the Volcano and you've inflated a large bag or a whip. Brilliant product, but it's not anything like our market. Totally not aiming for our market. These are hardcore kind of cannabis aficionados and enthusiasts. We're regular people who are looking at, consuming cannabis for the first time, just getting into using cannabis, return users coming back, people who want a lighter experience or something portable on the go with a stylish device,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a very nice kind of pebble-shaped device, very nice in the hand. How much kind of inspiration or how do you view IQOS? Because that's probably, a very kind of good comparable, similar technology, but for the tobacco industry.
It's a good one. I mean, I'd say probably I'd say it's almost like Pax meets IQOS, if there was any two products to bring together to form what we are. I mean, I'd had the privilege of spending a few years solid studying each and every one of the heat not burn devices in cannabis, literally taking them apart, understanding the benefits of conduction versus convection and all the different methodologies and different ways that these existing units worked. So I knew what the best way of consuming cannabis was, and that was, primarily convection. The IQOS, where I was going to get onto it, the IQOS obviously uses conduction, and, they spent $4 billion developing IQOS. It is an excellent product, but it's not without its flaws. It uses conduction, and it has the heat bar that goes inside a reconstituted tobacco sheet inside the stick. It kind of welds itself to the tobacco sheet. And then if you pull the stick out, it leaves the tobacco behind. So they have developed this little bucket that pushes it out. It works pretty well. I think essentially IQOS was trying to replicate or reproduce the smoking experience, i.e. giving a large visible exhalant and feeling like you were smoking a cigarette, but without, some of the harmful sides to it. But when I looked at conduction and using conduction with cannabis, it would be a flawed product. We actually considered having a product which may be compatible with the IQOS, but then we realized throughout our experiments and our research that the best way to heat the cannabis was going to be convection. And we did want to have a pre-filled stick format. We wanted something which was accessible, understandable to the consumer. In all honesty, kind of a parallel to IQOS. People who were familiar with IQOS in the market, they would see our product in the stick and they would simply get it. It's like IQOS for cannabis. And we've very much achieved that, especially in the European market.
Yeah, we'll go on to talk about that in a second. And how long does that product development kind of process take?
It actually took us quite a mind-blowingly fast period of time. I think it's probably because there'd been a lot of pent-up kind of ideas all brewing around and lots of experience in similar fields. And we'd had various companies creating products, invention and technologies. So we kind of knew what we wanted to do from the start. It didn't actually take us that long. It probably took us about 8 months from conception to having a working product out of the factory regarding the device and the entire fill system, where we have a machine that fills 500 sticks in a couple of minutes. So we kind of came out the gate at breakneck speed. That said, we've spent the last 2 years now really refining it. Our product worked when we developed and launched it, but it was just a bit clunkier. We've refined the stick. We went down from a 3-ply to a 2-ply. So we've really maximized the amount of flower ratio. We changed the device, as you may have seen the original one, which was a kind of a stacked oven vertical device, to the new device, which is a Series X, it's just a beautiful form, really fits in the hand perfectly. Nice use of materials, optimized the oven. So essentially, I'd say it took us a few years to get where we are. And those improvements were very rapid at the start, but very refining over the last couple of years. And we're refining the products all the time. We're having a new launch shortly of a Series X limited edition, which is die-cast magnesium. And it's beautiful. It's so nice. We've just been tweaking all of the little elements now. So we're kind of really getting into our stride.
Yeah, that's great. Constantly refining and going back to improve the product is kind of an ongoing task, I imagine.
In our nature, if I go back a little bit, I didn't really talk much about my toy life after Lego, but we had a toy invention company called J-Kid. We actually came up with the world's first interactive toy called Test Tube Aliens. It's actually a big hit in the UK, probably about 15 years ago now, but we sold about 10 million units of this Test Tube Aliens product. But I'll not go into that one in this session, but essentially our company was about developing new technologies and licensing new technologies to the toy industry. And in the toy industry, there's a cyclic. You need to create new technologies every single season because, that's what the industry requires. So it's a constant process of iteration, refinement, evolution. And then we've brought that kind of mindset into the cannabis industry where we're always going to be coming up with the new product, a refinement on the old product, creating new technologies inside, just keeping doing what we're good at.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And we'll talk a bit more about the general topic of vaping and how heat not burn compares to other ways of ingestion. But how's COVID treated the business? Your startup or a relatively new business?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, the business of cannabis, it's treated very well. I think a lot of people are consuming an awful lot more through COVID. So the business itself has been accelerated. Our business, it's an interesting one. It kind of splits into mindsets. The idea of heat not burn over combustion when there's a pulmonary disease out there, people are really now considering more about what they're putting into their lungs. So I think the whole area of non-combustion or harm reduction or heat not burn specifically is probably going to be much, much benefited through or because of COVID. The side to that is launching a new technology throughout COVID when it was mostly curbside pickup in the US especially has been a challenge, or the appetite for investment into new technologies and companies was, really hampered for a while. So it's really stalled us over a year or so. It's really stopped our progress. But in the long term, it's going to be beneficial, I think. Also, without going specifically to our product, we use this disposable stick, which is a disposable mouthpiece, and this whole puff, puff, pass it on kind of concept. It's a little bit tainted now.
Yeah. Well, it definitely addresses a need, that has come up around COVID. So that does make sense. So let's broaden the topic out and sort of talk a bit about some of the basics of vaping cannabis. I mean, what are some of the main ways of doing it, including your preferred method?
Cannabis consumption. I mean, you couldn't have wrote it how diversified. I mean, it's probably been around. In fact, all of these methods have probably been around for 5,000 years, but then suddenly, they've all been packaged and put on a separate shelf. So, I mean, obviously edibles. Now edibles, we are now not just, the gummies and the chocolates, the likes, but we have sublinguals and other ingestibles. And obviously the whole drinks industry is now just exploding, the kind of drinks industry. But then topicals and suppositories. And, if there's basically there's a place in your body you can rub it or insert it, it's been covered. It's pretty incredible. But it's interesting what's going to actually shake out, which we're going to end up being methods, the primary methods of consumption in the future. I think all of them will still exist. And I think it's obviously a massive marketplace. But I actually think the ritual of inhalation, I think that's with us. And I think it's going to be one of the preferred methods, for an ongoing basis. And I think it's very much to do with the ritual. The ritual's always been celebrated with joints or, the whole scenario, talk about this puff, puff, pass it on or rolling a joint or this whole ritual. But it's just a social activity as opposed to an ingestible or, like an edible. On many other methods, you eat something, then after a period of time, something happens, and it's, it can be quite a long period, and it can actually last for quite a while. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially, medical users or people who want to have that experience. But it's not like you want to go and sit in a bar or in a beer garden and flip down a gummy, then wait for something to happen necessarily. I think the idea of having an inhalable product, which has got a defined period of time, how long it lasts, and you feel, an extremely rapid onset through inhalation, as we talk about the bioavailability of vapor, and the efficacy and that rapid onset, I think it's extremely desirable.
Yeah.
I think I went a bit wide there. Sorry, you talked about all the different methods of consumption,
It's a really good setting, though. I think it's good to contrast the other ways of consuming cannabis. I think you're right that inhalation is the one that's probably most well known, but we are much more conscious of our kind of respiratory health now for COVID reasons, but also generally smoking is definitely now seen as a very bad decision for your health. How has vaping in its different forms sort of come up to challenge that? And what are the different types of vaping that are available generally?
It's a great question. Obviously, this has kind of been my area of kind of expertise, research and knowledge for the last maybe 17 years, coming through, all through big tobacco and into cannabis. And, we had the option of, looking at starting an oil vaping cannabis device or company at the time. But I seen the market was pretty saturated. We couldn't have predicted Vapegate or all of these things that happened with, tainted substances in vaporizers a number of years ago. Nor could we have really predicted the rise and fall of Juul, what was happening there and teen targeting and things like that, or even the fact that industry has been targeted by so many different groups, people, whether that be do-gooders and pharmaceutical companies, and everybody's had a shot at the vape industry. I think vaping an oil or an e-cig, with PG and VG and nicotine in the industry, we talk about it being 98, 99% healthier than smoking a cigarette. So in my opinion, vaping across the board will have revolutionized, inhalation and will be the preferred method going forward. Obviously over the last 5,000 years or whichever, we've only had a flame, and that's if we're lucky, but after electronics has been developed, there's better ways to boil off volatiles, essentially. That's essentially what it comes down to. We have substances or we have stimulants inside of plant matter, and we literally can heat them up, or we can transform them using electronics and technologies for a healthier, cleaner ingestion. But that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. So when comparing oil pens and, heat not burn, especially for cannabis, Generally with an oil pen, you need to cut it down with something to make, change the viscosity or the way it behaves. And obviously that's then subject to potentially putting other things in your body that you hadn't intended to. And also you touched on the potential of contaminants that could potentially be in contact through heating the oils up. I think the benefit of heat not burn over like kind of an e-liquid or heating an oil up is you're back using the natural product. You've literally got the whole flower in the Omura stick or any other heat not burn product essentially. We only have the whole flower. We don't even have trim, shake, leaf or anything like that. It's literally the bud, the ground bud, the best bit. And that's the only part that you're heating up. And I mean, there's a few sides to that. I mean, one is it is the whole flower. So there's nothing else added. But on top of that, it means you get the full entourage effect or the full spectrum effect. You get all of the cannabinoids and terpenes operating together. And obviously the research is out on that, unfortunately, many decades behind where it should be. But we'll find out in the future what this whole entourage effect is and how that behaves with the endocannabinoid system. But essentially, when you use heat not burn whole flower, then you are ingesting the purity of the entire plant.
Yeah, a very good way of summarising that. And actually, we'll talk about that in a second a bit more. It's interesting if you can sort of just dig in a little bit on the different types of oil. So there's a difference between like oil and e-liquids, is there not?
There's a lot of differences out there, so I'll try and keep it basic. There's nicotine consumption or cannabis consumption, so we split them already. Nicotine, it's generally cut. I mean, nicotine's extremely strong and you can't use nicotine pure. It needs to be dissolved or cut with other substances in order to allow it to be used in a vaporizer pen. So it's normally with PG, which is polyethylene glycol, or VG, vegetable glycerine, or sometimes a combination of two. And there's different ways and there's different preferences for different people. I think using VG was often preferred if people were using sub-ohm vaporizers to create these huge clouds when people talked about cloud chasing. And I think that was just because of the nature of being able to create a larger cloud with VG. As things kind of evolved, I mean, if I go back a little bit, there used to be the cigar-like, which is something that replicated a cigarette, i.e. it was a very small cigarette tube electronic vaporizer, like the original one, Honlick, designed. And then people realizing they didn't actually perform, they started winding their own box mods and their own coils and making these things that looked essentially like a brick. They had a few batteries in there. And they could create these massive clouds. And these are two total ends of the spectrum. One people were getting passionate about and people were really stopping smoking cigarettes to use these box mods. I remember going into vape shops when I moved over to California originally, seeing packets of cigarettes on the shelf with people's signatures on. And I was, what's that? And the guy would be like, their lives saved. These are people that came in here and said, that's my last pack of cigarettes. I'm going to sign it. And they put it on the shelf. They were almost like, tombstones is probably the wrong analogy, but the opposite of, literally people were evangelists. And everybody that owned a vape shop in those days was an evangelist who vaping had saved their life. So it's interesting because I'm going to move on to Juul next. Juul kind of managed to hit a sweet spot of, even though there's a brilliant, beautiful new form factor, they'd introduced nicotine salts, which allowed the nicotine, the bioavailability or the way it behaved in the bloodstream, much larger effect, something that replicated that of a cigarette. And nobody had managed to achieve that in such a small device before. So that just changed the whole nature. That changed the game, I think. I remember, pointing them out to BAT very many times in the early days as a potential acquisition target, because we knew at that time it was going to be a game changer. Obviously that rise and, I'm not sure if it is a fall per se. I just read Big Vape. I'm not sure if you've read that book yet. It talks about the rise and fall of Juul. There's a lot of things happened there that we may or may not go into in today's session. But that was me summarizing nicotine. Sorry. If we go over to cannabis, an interesting one, some of the earlier vape products, I say earlier, they've had the 510 cartridges around forever. But, people like Dosist came out with effect-based marketing, like Bliss or, whichever. But a lot of these products at that time were using kind of isolates, or they were just having it was a high THC, or it was, isolated THC, and reintroducing other terpenes and cut with other materials. And I think they always had questionable value because, you would get high, but people would always say it's a different high. It wasn't really what I wanted, it's not what I was used to from smoking. So I think there's other processes out there now, like rosin, for example, that just heats the flower up and squeezes the oil out. So you can actually have full spectrum oil out there, or full, giving the full entourage effect. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. But I think, maybe to the broad point is there's a lot of kind of questionable products out there. And I think if I was going to be an oil consumer, I'd really want to know what I was using,
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I guess, yeah, it makes quite a lot of sense. If you have dry herb, you can kind of see what it is and, it's a bit more understandable. But if you've got a kind of nondescript oil that could literally be anything, you have less certainty over what's in it, I suppose.
We've seen that over the last couple of years, I say with Vapegate, and, there's been some awful products out there on the market. I think if you stick with big brands and companies that you're probably going to be fine and safe. I'm not going to scaremonger anybody into not using oils. But I think one of the reasons, or the main reason that people started using oils or these oil pens, was the hygiene and convenience. Compared to smoking a joint, for example, you could hit on one of these pens outside the cinema before you go in for the movie. It would be it's certainly quite hard to detect, or be very easy to hit on the pen. It's interesting. I think Omura has brought that hygiene and convenience into the whole flower category. It didn't exist anywhere before. You could have a pre-rolled joint, but you set fire to it and you're in the world's biggest Cheech and Chong cloud and everyone knows it. Or if you're using a packs, you've still got to go through that process of grinding, packing and filling and emptying it out. So the hygiene and convenience is probably one of the, the main factors that we've catered for, with the Omura, the pre-filled stick, pop it in, very little odor. You still get the full entourage effect and you can do it very discreetly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what's quite apparent in a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is there's a bit of education that's needed, right? These are relatively new technologies and ways of consuming. Mm-hmm. How have you found that journey? How receptive are people? How quick are people to cotton on? How much hand-holding do you need to do?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, there's lots of kind of analogies and parallels here. I think, if you were talking about using a vape pen for cannabis and we'd seen vape pens for nicotine around the world, and I think that's one of the other reasons why it accelerated the growth of vape pens for cannabis so rapidly, because people were just familiar with vaping nicotine, for example, and also they borrowed the technologies, which often does happen in the industry in cannabis. There's technology being developed for nicotine, so it's a very similar thing that's happening for Omura and heat not burn in general. I'd say, because this IQOS device by Philip Morris, which is very popular in Europe. It's actually in 57 countries now. It hasn't actually penetrated the US yet. So in the US, it's a bigger lift. There's an educational piece. We need to tell people about heat not burn and the benefits of heat not burn. Whereas in Europe, and certainly coming out of those two shows in Paris and Germany, it was very, very apparent. People would see our stand and they would walk up to me and say, is that IQOS, like for cannabis? And it was like, it's such an easy get. So I think basically having big tobacco out there trailblazing it for us is definitely going to be helpful.
Yeah, that is useful. They spend the billions on the marketing dollars to help you. Ultimately, that's quite useful.
And I think it's why heat not burn, in my opinion, is better for cannabis over tobacco. When you look at tobacco, it's normally a singular product. They reconstitute tobacco sheet, and essentially they'll be coming out with the tobacco version or the menthol version wherever it's allowed. But with, heat not burn for whole flower, we've got hundreds and hundreds of strains out there. So it's very much like the craft beer of, the industry. And it's, again, when you have an oil, you generally have oil. It's not far off that and you're not really sure what's in there. But as the research kind of unfolds, and certainly as people's user preferences unfold and, these new strains are being developed and grown, people are going to have preferences over the effect of each individual strain and the flavour of each individual strain. And I think that's one of the huge benefits that whole flower and heat not burn especially brings, is the individual or the celebration of the individual strains and the actual tasting of those strains, through heat not burn over combustion.
Yeah, a very, very valid point, actually. And, I think something that people are trying to recreate through extracts and are going to great expense, and it's definitely not perfect yet. So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as we come to sort of the end of the show, I think your product is obviously very well suited for the US market, where there is a different level of legalization in different states, etc. Bringing it back to Europe, which is obviously more of a medical market, are you seeing kind of medical applications for, possible medical applications for your device or the general industry?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we only launched in the US under the guise of recreational because it was recreationally legal, where we are, and we'll be launching in medical states too. Obviously, there's a very blurred boundary between what's recreational and what's medical, if we were quite honest. But for genuine medical application, there's a few strong benefits. I mean, firstly, a physician would be really pained to recommend somebody combust anything. You know, if I was a physician making a recommendation, the last thing I would want to say is, here's a bag of flour, go and set fire to it. So for a medical application, heat not burn whole flour is actually, I think, the perfect scenario, because it's the natural product and you're only extracting the cannabinoids using heat. So that, you know, it's a healthier way of consuming it. But then on top of that, if it's pre-filled with a known dose, that's also something which is very valuable from a physician or a medical perspective, because you know how high you're going to get from a single dose. And the Omura stick does have a single dose with a known amount. And on top of that, it's actually pre-filled, so it's extremely convenient to use. If I've got some kind of dexterity issues, then pick up a stick and put it in the device, which is preset, is an extremely easy, you know, medical product to use. So actually, I think, you know, the application for medical for the Omura platform is actually very strong. We're going through the process of medical certification in Germany and UK at the moment. So we will be aiming for those medical markets. But on a flip side of looking at legality as opposed to, you know, recreational or medical, we do acknowledge there's certain areas in the world where people do still consume either hemp CBD or cannabis flower, but they don't have a legal framework there yet. So Omura is now launching empty stick platform, so consumers can fill their empty sticks by themselves. And basically that's going to allow everybody to get on the platform without us having to enter each market with a flower brand and then going through their retail distribution. Now we can actually just hit the global market with, and gain product and brand recognition, and then fold the flower brands in where, you know, where legislation allows.
Yeah, and things are changing, albeit quite slowly in Europe, but hopefully things are moving. Mike, that's been really great, actually, and I really appreciate you taking the time. There's loads we could talk about, and it's really, really interesting to see how you guys get on in Europe and just generally. So would love to have you back on the show at some point.
Thanks, Anuj. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm obviously very passionate about my subject, and I could talk about it all day long.
Well, that's definitely a good reason to get you back on at some point then. Thank you. Cheers, Mike.
Thanks, Anuj.
Cheers. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.